The night the blizzard came, the entire village disappeared beneath a blanket of white. The wind screamed across the frozen fields, shaking the windows of every cottage and burying the narrow roads beneath mountains of snow. The kind of storm that forced even the strongest men indoors. The kind that made travelers turn back before it was too late. But someone was still out there, far beyond the warmth of the village fires, beyond the last lantern glowing along the country road. A man was fighting against the cold, with every breath he had left, and he was running out of time. In a small cottage at the edge of the woods lived Clara Whitmore, a young woman who had learned far too early that life did not always offer kindness. After losing both of her parents, she had remained in the little home they left behind, carrying on their memory through the simple life they had built together. Clara had no grand estate, no servants, and no noble family name. She owned little more than the cottage, a small garden buried beneath the snow, and the determination to survive whatever challenges came her way. But what Clara lacked in wealth, she carried in compassion. That evening, while the storm raged outside, she prepared extra food in case any villager needed help. She checked the fire carefully, knowing that many nearby families struggled through the harsh winter months. She had always believed that a person's worth was not measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to give. Then, sometime after midnight, when the wind was at its strongest, Clara heard something. At first, she thought it was only the storm, a branch breaking, a piece of wood falling, something carried by the violent wind. But then she heard it again, a faint sound, a desperate sound. Someone was outside. Clara stood frozen beside the fireplace. Every sensible thought told her to stay inside. The storm was dangerous. The snow was deep. Whoever was outside might already be beyond saving, but she could not ignore the possibility that someone needed her. Wrapping herself in a heavy cloak, Clara stepped into the freezing night. The world outside was almost impossible to see. Snow whipped against her face as she searched through the darkness until she noticed a figure lying several feet away from her cottage. A man, unmoving. Clara rushed toward him and fell to her knees in the snow. He was injured. His clothes were torn from the journey, but even beneath the layers of ice and exhaustion, she could see something unusual about him. His clothing was made from expensive material. His hands carried no signs of ordinary labor. Even unconscious, there was a presence about him, a quiet authority that suggested he was someone used to being obeyed. But Clara did not see a title. She did not see wealth. She only saw a man who would die if she left him there. With every ounce of strength she had, Clara dragged him back to her cottage. Through the long hours of the night, she cleaned his wounds, kept the fire burning, and fought against the cold that threatened to take his life. Near dawn, the stranger finally opened his eyes. For a moment, his gaze met hers. Confusion, pain, and something else she could not understand. "Who are you?" Clara whispered. The man tried to answer, but his voice was weak. "My name does not matter." Then his eyes closed again. Clara did not know why he wanted to hide his identity. She did not know why a man, dressed like a nobleman, had been found alone in the middle of a deadly storm. She only knew one thing. She had rescued a stranger from the snow, but she had no idea she had saved the life of a man whose name could change her entire future. For several days after the blizzard, the stranger remained between strength and weakness. The wounds he carried were deeper than Clara first realized. The cold had taken its toll, and the injuries from whatever had happened before she found him left him unable to travel. But every morning, Clara entered the small room where he rested with the same quiet determination. She changed his bandages, prepared his meals, and kept the fire burning, even when her own supplies began to run low. She never complained. She never reminded him that she was sacrificing her own comfort for his survival. To Clara, helping someone in need was not a burden. It was simply the right thing to do. When the stranger became strong enough to sit by the fireplace, he finally offered her a name. Alexander, he said. It was only one word, carefully chosen. He did not tell her about his family. He did not tell her about his estate, his servants, or the title that carried his name across the kingdom. To Clara, he was simply Alexander, a man recovering from a terrible night. And that was exactly what surprised him. Most people who entered his world knew his position before they knew him. They measured their words carefully. They offered respect because of his title, not because of the person beneath it. But Clara did not treat him like someone important. She treated him like someone human. When he became frustrated by his weakness, Clara calmly reminded him that accepting help did not make him powerless. A person does not become less strong because they need someone beside them, she told him. The words stayed with him long after she walked away. As the days passed, their conversations became longer. They shared simple meals beside the fireplace while snow slowly melted outside. They spoke about dreams they had never reached, choices they wished they could change, and the quiet regrets they carried. For the first time in years, Alexander laughed without pretending. Clara had a way of bringing warmth into moments that should have felt ordinary. She did not know she was sitting beside a duke. She did not care, and that was what made him notice her even more. For the first time in years, Alexander Ravenshire forgot about duty, wealth, and expectations. But just as the storm disappeared, another storm was waiting, the world he had left behind. The truth arrived before Clara was ready to hear it. 3 days after the blizzard ended, the quiet village that had been buried beneath snow finally began to awaken. Paths were cleared, smoke rose from chimneys again, and travelers slowly returned to the roads. Then came the riders. A group of men entered the village, carrying the colors of one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. They had been searching for their missing master since the storm began. Clara watched from the doorway as they approached her cottage. At first, she thought they had come looking for another lost traveler. Then one of the men saw Alexander sitting beside the fire. His expression changed instantly. "My lord," the words froze Clara in place. Alexander looked toward the doorway, and for the first time she saw the weight of the identity he had hidden. The men bowed before him, not because they respected him as a traveler, because they knew him as Duke Alexander Ravenshire, one of the most respected noblemen in the kingdom. Clara stood silently, trying to understand what she had just learned. The man she had cared for, the man she had argued with beside the fireplace, the man she had reminded to be humble, was not simply Alexander. He was a duke, a man whose name carried influence far beyond her small village. Suddenly, every conversation they had felt different. She wondered how many things he had left unsaid. Alexander noticed the change in her expression. "Clara," he said gently, "I never meant to deceive you." And she believed him. Because despite his hidden identity, she had seen the truth of who he was before she knew his title. His servants prepared for their journey back to his estate, and before leaving, Alexander stopped beside her. "I will never forget what you did for me," he promised. Then he rode away. For Clara, life slowly returned to normal. But the village did not remain quiet for long. People whispered about the young woman who had sheltered a duke. Some said she had simply been fortunate. Others questioned why a man of Alexander's position had spent so many days beneath the roof of someone with no noble name. Far away at his estate, Alexander returned to his responsibilities. But the grand halls and endless duties felt different now, because everywhere he went, he remembered the woman who had looked at him without fear or expectation. Everyone expected Duke Alexander Ravenshire to return to his old life and forget the woman from the snow, but they underestimated the one thing he could not command, his own heart. Winter eventually released its grip on the countryside. The snow that had once covered every field began to disappear, revealing green grass beneath the frozen ground. The rivers began to flow again, flowers returned to the gardens, and the village slowly came back to life. For Clara, spring brought a return to the simple routine she knew. She worked in her small garden, helped her neighbors, and continued living the quiet life she had always known. But there was one difference. She thought about Alexander, not the Duke, just Alexander, the man who had sat beside her fireplace, shared stories with her, and smiled when she teased him about his stubborn pride. But Clara also understood reality. A man like Alexander belonged to a world of grand estates, royal gatherings, and powerful families. A woman like her belonged to a small cottage at the edge of a village. Their lives had crossed because of a storm. She believed they were never meant to meet again, until one spring morning, when elegant carriages arrived at her cottage. The entire village noticed. People stepped outside their homes as horses stopped along the road, and finely dressed attendants approached Clara's door. Her heart raced when the carriage opened, and then she saw him, Alexander. But he was no longer the injured stranger she had pulled from the snow. He stood before her as Duke Alexander Ravenshire, dressed in the finest clothing, carrying the presence of a man who commanded respect wherever he went. Yet when he looked at Clara, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only gratitude, only warmth. "I have wanted to return sooner," he told her, "but I needed time to understand something." Clara listened quietly. Alexander explained that after returning to his estate, he expected life to feel the same as before. He returned to meetings, responsibilities, and the endless demands that came with his position. But something had changed. Everything he once believed mattered felt different. The wealth, the celebrations, the admiration of others, it all seemed empty compared to the kindness of the woman who had opened her door to him when he had nothing to offer. "You saved my life," Alexander said, "but you also reminded me what it meant to truly live." Clara looked away, uncertain. "Why would a duke return for someone like me?" Alexander answered without hesitation. "Because you were the only person who saw me without my title." And those words changed everything. From that day forward, Alexander returned often. The village watched in disbelief as a duke traded grand halls for quiet walks, formal dinners for simple meals, and endless conversations about duty for peaceful moments beside Clara. The man who had once been surrounded by luxury discovered that happiness could exist in the smallest places. But while Clara and Alexander found comfort in each other, the world beyond the village was beginning to take notice. Returning to Clara was easy, but convincing the world that the woman who saved his life belonged beside him would become the greatest battle of his own. As the seasons changed, the story of Duke Alexander Ravenshire and the woman from the village traveled far beyond the countryside. At first, it was only a quiet rumor. A duke had been visiting a woman with no noble title. A duke had been seen walking through the village streets instead of attending the gatherings of the royal court. A duke who had once been expected to make a powerful marriage alliance was choosing to spend his time with someone the aristocracy barely knew. Before long, those whispers reached the grand halls of the kingdom. Among the noble families, questions began to rise. Some believed Alexander's actions were only a passing fascination. Others believed he was risking his family's reputation by allowing his feelings to guide his decisions. For generations, noble marriages had been built on alliances, wealth, and influence. Love was considered a luxury. Duty was considered a responsibility. Many believed Alexander should choose a wife who matched his position, someone who understood the expectations of his world. One name was mentioned more often than any other: Lady Victoria Ashford. She came from one of the wealthiest families in the kingdom. She was admired for her elegance, education, and connections. Many had assumed that one day she would become the Duchess of Ravenshire, but Alexander refused to see marriage as a transaction. He had spent his entire life fulfilling expectations placed upon him. He understood the importance of duty, but he also knew that a life without genuine connection was a life only half-lived. Meanwhile, Clara struggled with a fear she rarely admitted. She loved Alexander, but she also understood the distance between their worlds. She worried that one day he would wake up and realize that his place was not beside a woman from a small village. She feared that her presence would become a burden, forcing him to choose between his happiness and his responsibilities. One evening, Alexander found her lost in thought. "You believe you are taking something from me," he said quietly. Clara looked away. "I do not want to become the reason you lose everything you have worked for." Alexander took her hand. "You are not taking anything from me," he told her. "You are the reason I finally understand what all those things were supposed to mean." His words reminded her that he had not chosen her because she was easy to love. He had chosen her because she was honest, brave, and kind. Their bond grew stronger, but the pressure surrounding them continued to increase. His family demanded answers. The court waited for his decision, and Alexander knew that soon he would have to choose between the tradition that had shaped his entire life and the woman who had changed it forever. The court could question her birth, her wealth, and her place beside him, but they could never erase the night she had opened her door when everyone else had closed theirs. The conflict Alexander had hoped to avoid finally reached them. For weeks, he had believed that patience would be enough, that if people saw Clara's kindness, her strength, and her character, they would eventually understand why she mattered to him. But the past had not finished following him. One afternoon, a former member of Alexander's household arrived at Ravenshire Estate, carrying information that changed everything. The accident during the blizzard had not been as simple as everyone believed. The man revealed that Alexander's journey through the countryside had been known by very few people. Someone had discovered his plans before he left, and there were signs that the storm had only made a dangerous situation worse. The carriage damage, the missing escort, the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance. They were beginning to look less like bad luck and more like a carefully planned attempt to keep the Duke away from the court. Alexander immediately ordered an investigation. But as the truth began to surface, another problem appeared. Clara, because she had been the last person to see him before he vanished. and when people wanted answers, they looked for someone to blame. Whispers that had once questioned Clara's place beside the Duke now became something darker. Some suggested she had used the situation to gain Alexander's attention. Others claimed that a woman from a small village had no reason to be involved with a duke unless she wanted something in return. The accusations were cruel, but they spread quickly. Alexander refused to accept them. He knew Clara better than anyone. He knew the woman who had walked into a deadly storm to save a stranger had no desire for power or influence. "She saved my life when she had nothing to gain," Alexander told those who questioned her. "That is the truth I will always remember." But even his support could not stop Clara from feeling the weight of the situation. She began to wonder if she had become the reason Alexander's world was falling apart. One evening, she looked toward the estate that had become the center of so much conflict and admitted what she had been afraid to say. "Perhaps I should leave." Alexander looked at her in disbelief. "You think leaving will protect me?" Clara lowered her eyes. "I think you have already sacrificed enough because of me." But Alexander knew the truth. The greatest loss would not be losing his reputation. It would not be losing the approval of the court. It would be losing the woman who had shown him kindness when the entire world knew him only by his title. For the first time since the storm, Alexander faced a fear greater than death itself, the possibility of losing the woman who had given him a reason to truly live. The truth could not remain hidden forever. Determined to clear Clara's name, Alexander refused to allow rumors to decide the fate of the woman who had risked everything for him. He returned to the events of that night with careful attention. He questioned those who had been involved in his journey, examined the evidence surrounding the damaged carriage, and searched for the person who had benefited most from his disappearance. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. The betrayal had not come from Clara. It had come from someone much closer to the world Alexander knew. A trusted figure within his own circle had attempted to delay his return to court, hoping to create uncertainty and weaken his position. The blizzard had provided the perfect opportunity, and Clara's unexpected involvement had simply become an easy target for those looking for someone to blame. When the evidence was finally presented, the accusations against Clara collapsed. The woman they had questioned, the woman they had judged, the woman they had considered unworthy of standing beside a duke was the same woman who had saved him when others would have walked away. The truth reached the royal court, and Alexander knew there was one final thing he had to do. He would not defend Clara privately. He would not hide their relationship away from those who believed they had the right to judge her. He stood before the court and spoke openly. "This woman gave me shelter when I had nothing to offer her," he said. "She cared for me without knowing my name, my title, or my position. She saw a person before she saw a duke." The room fell silent. Alexander continued. "Her worth was never determined by her family name, her wealth, or the place where she was born. It was proven on the coldest night of the year, when her kindness was greater than her fear. For the first time, many who had doubted Clara saw her differently. They saw the courage it took to face a storm. They saw the compassion that had saved a man they respected. They saw that a noble title could be inherited, but true character had to be earned. Clara stood beside Alexander, no longer feeling like someone who had entered a world where she did not belong. She finally understood something important. Alexander had never chosen her because he needed someone to save him. He had chosen her because she was the one person who understood him when the rest of the world only saw his title. Their love was not built on wealth or status. It was built on trust, kindness, and the simple moment when one person chose to help another. The woman who had found him frozen and broken in the snow had become the person who brought warmth back into every corner of his life. Years passed, but the story of Duke Alexander Ravenshire and Clara Whitmore remained one that people never forgot. Clara was no longer known only as the woman who had saved a duke during a terrible storm. She became respected throughout the kingdom for her compassion, wisdom, and strength. Those who once questioned her place beside Alexander came to understand that her value had never come from a title. It came from the person she had always been. Together, Alexander and Clara built a life that balanced duty with happiness. The Duke continued serving his responsibilities, but he never forgot the simple moments that had changed him. The quiet conversations beside the fireplace, the kindness of a woman who expected nothing in return, and the night when a stranger opened her door to him. Their love became a reminder that the strongest connections are not created by wealth, power, or status. They are created when two people truly see each other. Years later, people remembered Duke Alexander Ravenshire for his estates, his influence, and his name. But the Duke himself remembered only one moment above all others: the night when a woman with nothing to gain opened her door during a blizzard and saved his life. If you enjoyed this royal love story, subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable tales of dukes, duchesses, hidden secrets, and extraordinary romances. Join us for the next story where love, destiny, and royalty collide.